Good afternoon, everyone. My colleagues at TSA, welcome to this webinar. I'm Ian Anderson, the president of TSA, and we are delighted to have you with us. My wife described these past 2 months as like a succession of Sundays, every day kind of like before. So we are all really pleased to make this Friday a little bit more special for you with a couple of terrific thought leaders. Veronica Clark from Citigroup is a prominent economist. You will have read her frequently on Bloomberg, Reuters, CNBC, BNN. She's with Citigroup, and she's been particularly active in the media this spring. She's based in New York and has degrees from the University of North Carolina and NYU. She brings a continental and global perspective to the economics of the lockdown and what will follow. Stats released today show U.S. consumer spending dropped nearly 14% in April, making the economic impact of this virus just truly without precedent. So I think we're all really looking forward to Veronica's assessment of the road ahead. Rana Sarkar is known to many of you. I would have called him a rising star 10 years ago, and he's still rising. As the Canadian government's lead person in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, Rana is really redefining what a really effective Consul General can do for his or her home country. Rana has unique insights into how cutting-edge technology is impacting the workplace, and I can only expect that the COVID-19 shock will accelerate these changes. In addition to all his great work as a diplomat, Rana's also took great pleasure in wearing his Raptors colors and Warriors country last spring during the NBA Championship Series, and we hope probably by the summer he'll be able to do the same. Both of your speakers today will bring unique insights into what is happening and where this is leading. So let's get going. My colleague Ryan Singh is going to explain a few things about the agenda and how you can participate.
Great, thank you, Ian, and welcome everyone. Just a quick overview of what to expect today. I will go over how you participate in today's webinar. Then my colleague Scott Munnick will introduce our guests and talk a little bit about the upcoming presentations that you should expect. Then we'll hear from our guest speakers, Rana and Veronica. After that, we'll open it up for questions and answers. On that note, I do want to remind everybody there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So when you hover over the bottom, you should be able to see a Q&A button as the icon visible there. Feel free to click that. You can submit your questions. Scott will then relay those questions live to our guests here on the webinar. Alternatively, you can email your questions to info@tsa.ca. We'll make sure those get to Scott as well. With that, thank you again for joining, and I'll hand it over to Scott.
Thanks, Ryan, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again from our group. Today's meant to be an informal discussion, hopefully interactive with all of you and the questions you may have. We've got two great speakers, I think. Ironically, one representing the East Coast and one representing the West Coast in the States, with Veronica being in New York and Rana in San Francisco. And so with that, we're going to ask them each to give us about a few minutes overview on how they see the impacts of COVID and how we come out of it. And then we'll open it up to discussion and questions afterwards. So with that in mind, we'll first hear from Veronica. So Veronica, over to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here today. I'll just start by, going over just informally kind of how I'm thinking about everything. It is, of course, no one has heard this many times. Everyone's heard this. It's very uncertain times. It's a very hard thing to measure, put numbers to. I think it's pretty well expected now that we're going to have this really steep drop in activity globally in Q2. So for Canada, of course, we just got the Q1 GDP numbers out this morning, had an 8.2% annualized decline in Q1. That's really only a few weeks of this shutdown starting mid-March. Of course, Q2 then will be worse. We've had, April activity was, at the bottom. We've had a start of a slow bounce back and reopening starting through May, and that can continue into June. Q2 will look terrible. There's really no better way to say it. Skyrocketing unemployment, drop in activity. All of that should be pretty expected. I would say that where I'm a little bit different from consensus expectations, I think, is that the rebound can actually look pretty strong also. So I think a lot of people are conditioned to see 15 to 20% unemployment, a drop in GDP of, Q2 we could get 40% annualized decline. Those numbers look terrible, and we're conditioned to compare them to past instances. So compare them to 2008 or even the Great Depression in the US. But I think what's important to keep in mind in this scenario, and one thing that makes me slightly more optimistic, is this really can't be compared to any past downturn. So this is not your normal recession where you have some bubble that has burst, some over leverage. There was some, the central bank was hiking too fast, raising rates too fast, and that made activity pull back. This is not just a demand recession. This is really, an external shock to both the demand and supply sides of the economy. And you had very intentional shutdowns. So, like, for instance, the decline in US April spending that we had this morning. Of course, part of that is because unemployment is high, people are not earning as much income, but also it's just because, things have been closed, and you're not going to go out and buy new clothes, or you're not going to travel. So part of it really is just very mechanical. And part of that then comes back pretty quickly. So that's why once you start to see things reopening and you're coming from such a low level, you can get pretty big growth rates when you bounce back. So of course now everyone's focused on the return of activity. There's been plenty of letters thrown around, is this going to be a V-shaped recovery, a U or a W, anything like that. The most accurate is probably it looks more like a swoosh. So you have this deep drop in activity initially, and then it takes a little while for the level of activity to go back to where you were. But initially you do get a fairly large bounce back in some of these things that got cut. A good example is maybe something like medical services. So medical service spending has fallen significantly. That is because, dentist offices were closed, non-essential medical services were closed. That kind of thing is where we could even see an overshoot of activity once things start to reopen. So if you didn't go to the dentist in April, you're hopefully going to go in May or in June. And anyone who would go in May and June is also going in those months. So some sectors of the economy can actually overshoot briefly. So that makes us a little bit more optimistic for the recovery. One of the other things that Canada, has going for it, I would say, is close ties to the US. So that's obviously the focus of our presentation here. And we are a bit more optimistic on the US rebound for similar reasons. You have this start-stop mentality. You also have significant fiscal support from both countries. With a stronger US rebound, you also have the scope for some stronger Canadian rebound. Part of that is through exports. Part of that is through just the general sentiment channel. So the countries will stay closely connected. Exports, of course, in things like oil, which will have its own headwinds. Then also, though, autos, manufacturing, anything like that, you'll have that initial intentional decline in activity, stop in production, and then things start to rebound. So another reason to be a little bit more optimistic, I think I touched on it briefly, is pretty significant fiscal response already. We've had significant fiscal and monetary responses. But in Canada especially, the response has been pretty dramatic, more than what we had in 2008, 2009. And what I'm encouraged by in particular is that I think everyone is probably well aware of, what measures are out there. You have the CERB benefit, the wage subsidy, loans for small and medium businesses. All of those have been significant. But what I'm most encouraged about actually is that the government has been pretty responsive to listening to the business community and tweaking some of these, extending who can apply for them, who will qualify for them, extending the wage subsidy. It was supposed to end in June. It will now go through August. So the ability and the willingness to adapt to the current shutdown situation seems to be there for me, which is encouraging. So all of that, I think, speaks to, you have, of course, a horrible economic situation right now, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you can't have a fairly solid pick back up in 2020 once things start to reopen. A few concerns, though. There's always two sides to the story. The downside risks are certainly there also. That uncertainty, works both ways. You could have a stronger rebound, and you could have a much softer rebound. A few things on the downside, though, of course, that are certainly important to note. We've known that Canadian household debt has been at a pretty unsustainably high level for a number of years. It's stabilized, before this. So the past few years, the addition of new debt has slowed, which is positive. And debt in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It becomes a bad thing when you have a decline in incomes, like what you get when you have high unemployment, and then high debt servicing. You have to pay your debt. That means you can't spend on other things. So that's how that translates to much softer recovery. In the near term, there have been a number of banks or tax delays, interest payment delays that should help support some spending in 2020 once things can reopen. Where that becomes more of an issue is into 2021. So if borrowing does have to increase a little bit during this year for households to make ends meet, and then you are adding on delayed debt payments already, that could slow consumption, for instance, in 2021. I would be more concerned there. Some other downside risks, of course, though, are the fiscal response has been significant for right now. I would become more interested to see what the fiscal response looks like into 2021. So the government is very willing to support households and businesses while things are shut down. But once we start to come out on the other side of this, there will be companies that businesses don't reopen, jobs that just don't come back. We're not going to be getting back to normal, of course. It will take some time. And then I want to see how much is the government going to be willing to support that recovery. So will there be things like infrastructure projects, in direct stimulus for households like what we've seen in the U.S. almost? So I'd be more interested to see how will the fiscal situation support activity later. And that's where I could maybe even see some downside. In the fiscal situation in Canada, you had the fiscal space to be spending. Deficits were lower than the U.S. Government debt is lower. Federal government debt is lower. So you have that room just to be spending. The desire to deficit spend is not always there in Canada like it is in the U.S. That was a positive coming into this, but maybe you do need a little bit to get going later in the year and in 2021. So that would certainly be a risk. Another interesting risk, and this ties more into the interconnectedness with the U.S. and just globally, is one of the key things that was supporting Canadian growth before COVID hit was really strong immigration growth. So for the last few years, 4 or 5 years, immigration has been a significant support to Canadian activity. It's very simple. You have more people working, and so that means you're growing. You're having growth supported. That is a very interesting going forward if that continues. Just from people are not traveling as much. People are worried about leaving or moving. I would hope that some of that immigration can come back, and I hope that it's not permanently depressed because it's a key support to growth. But again, that would be downside for why 2020 could maybe look a bit soft. But overall for 2020, I would think that rebound, the right materials are there. It's just now a matter of watching the data and seeing how things unfold.
Thanks, Veronica. Certainly a lot to think about. Rana, how about the view from San Francisco?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me here, and thanks to Ian, to Scott, to Ryan, to all of the team there, and I hope that everyone watching this is doing well in the midst of it. And I think that we're in the normalization phase of the current crises that you alluded to earlier, in the sense that the first phase clearly was the public health challenge and the immediate reaction to public health. And I think the context of that in the view from the United States is that comparative to the response of the United States, there's been people have been impressed generally with how Canada has handled it, both from a public health perspective, the level of coordination between governments that we're seeing with the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, all the provincial premiers, the connection points that we're seeing across Canada on the public health side have been very impressive to the U.S. more generally, but also global partners, which has been a great signal that often gets missed in the Canadian coverage of the issue. The second point, I think, is that as we enter this the so-called normalization phase pre-vax, we are heading into what some refer to as probably the 80% economy, and where, as Veronica alluded to, there are many sectors that will not bounce back. Clearly ones that have from the restaurant industry to a lot of the transportation, tourism industries, industries that Canada's had high reliance on. They won't bounce back to 100% very quickly, but we are going to get into a period very quickly as well, where we're going to have a bit of a contest and a bit of a debate over what economic numbers mean. I think Veronica alluded to that in the comment that this is not going to be 2008. It's not going to be the 1930s or anything that's demand and supply shock related. It's this is a fundamentally different beast from an economic calculation point of view. And we are going to start getting into an enormous debate. And so part of that debate will be, we'll probably see some of the most aggressive bounce back numbers in parts of the United States over the course of Q3 this year, going into election year. And so that will, and whether those numbers are, really indicative of profound bounce back of the economy, or whether they're as a result of the way in which we've calculated certain industry groupings. And so there's going to be what we've had thus far is we've had a pretty strong consensus view of how we've gone forward, and now I think we're going to start to break apart slightly in that view. But what I would say is that Canada, of course, we've got the double whammy of the oil shock in the midst of that, which is going to have a material impact on Canadian revenue numbers for its own purposes, which is going to be doubly compounded on the COVID issue. So that's something for many of us to keep our eye on. But that too, given the price of oil and the likelihood of a modest bounce back, will moderate itself. The other point that I would make, and I'll speak a little bit about technology as well, is that there are all of this masks or accelerates profound structural shifts in the Canadian economy and also the global economy. And what I would say to that is that Asia is already bouncing back, and the numbers, we spent a lot of time worrying about the U.S.-China relationship, which unduly, we should, but the reality of the world in 2030, 2050 is that Asia will be well over 5 billion people. Only 1 billion of those will live in China. And a lot of the middle class growth, a lot of the growth driving will take place in economies that aren't the US or China. And so it won't be sort of a two-track story. But that said, we are also, the other point that I would make around the global macro is that remind yourself of this phrase that you'll probably hear for the next while, which is the Japanification of everything. And what I mean by that is that we are going into a very prolonged period of extremely low interest rate environment, and that's going to profoundly change a lot of the assumptions that we've all had around debt and around the way in which we grow our economies and the way productivity works, and a lot of the other macroeconomic features that we've taken for granted. What I would say in terms of, I'll say something about capacity, and then I'll say something about technology. But what I'll say about capacity is that the other thing that I think a lot of Canadians will take to heart is that we've surprised ourselves in these last few months, in the sense that the Canadian government rolled out, the CRP was rolled out, from 3 weeks from the inception to the actual delivery, checks in people's hands, money in people's bank accounts. And that idea of the capacity that government can get things done fast, efficiently, and being coordinated with business and with other interests surprised even government, I'm sure. And so it's created a muscle memory within our institutions that big things can be done. I think that as a incentive for more change going forward is going to be a very important component of what takes place. The other structural aspects of what's taking place, the acceleration effects of technology. And clearly, I mean, Mark Andreessen's, line years ago that software is eating the world. Every company is going to become a software company, and the most efficient software companies will win. That dictum is proving itself out in many ways, in the sense that down here in the Valley, we recognize that this is not just the center of $5 trillion of economic growth, but we have some major companies, the Amazons of the world, go up and down. They lose or gain the price, the share price going in an average trading day. You've got Apple, which is more valuable than the entire U.S. energy industry. So these extraordinary, accelerated and exaggerated effects of technology as a sort of a category that's horizontal is also profound. The accelerance of technology in all of our lives is not something that we're speaking over one of these multiple redundant, probably there's 30 different platforms. Many of you experimented with them that are doing what we're doing right now. The other aspect of capacity is that people have surprised themselves at how quickly they have gone from the offline environment to the online environment. And that division in society between those who can actually work online and who have not missed a beat in going virtual in the way that all of you are watching this is going to become a increasing fissure, in the sense that I was on a call recently with the chairman of the U.S. Fed, who said that in March, 40% of those with incomes under $40,000 lost their job in the United States. And that is an extraordinary number. It's not to say that some of those won't come back very shortly, but just the impacts of this crisis on people who are at the lowest income levels versus the people who are able to shelter at home at the highest income levels. Those of you with relatively high incomes that are working in so-called top white-collar jobs, your likelihood of losing a job in this crisis is less than 10%, which is a pretty extraordinary number given the amount of displacement that's taking place in this economy. And so there are all of these interrelated accelerant effects that are taking place that are going to fundamentally change the nature of the Canadian economy going forward. And it's also going to create a whole set of new challenges and opportunities for Canadians as they start thinking about their relationship to the United States, their relationship to the rest of the world, and what type of industrial policy that we're looking to build going forward. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Rana. I think what was interesting is you both talked a little bit about while the hit on the economy has been dramatic, the possibility and the change may come quite quickly as we move on. Veronica, you mentioned that Q2 is a disaster, but you're optimistic a little bit on Q3 and perhaps Q4, and then moving into next year. So, and you even talked about whether it's a V or a U or a W, and you settled on a swoosh. So, if it is a swoosh, what do you see as the leading indicators what are you watching for that are going to hopefully make it go back to a V and get out of it quickly versus going in a long, drawn-out swoosh that keeps repeating itself?
Yeah, of any of the economic statistics to watch, I guess, I mean, the key one would be employment, monthly employment data. Yeah, the level of activity is not going to return to where we were going into this year. I'm hopeful that it gets to, where we were going in by the end of next year, by the end of 2021. Canada, of course, does have now the added energy sector shock. That means that the recovery will probably be slower than in the US, for example. I would say the pace of job gains is really going to be what I'll most closely be watching. Of course, we've had significant numbers of unemployment already. Some of those jobs will come back. Things like manufacturing, construction can come back faster than others. Those have been the sectors that have reopened earlier. We've actually even seen a lot of job losses, surprisingly, in, for instance, the medical sector. That has been a lot of those, office workers at doctors' offices or dental hygienists or people like that. Those kinds of services will also reopen sooner than others. And we should see employment coming back there. Those are necessary services where you do need people. It, of course, will be sectors like hospitality and transportation and restaurants. entertainment, any of those that are going to be a lot slower to rebound. And then also be watching the other sectors that are almost in that gray area where they're not necessarily directly impacted, but they have had job losses already, things like retailers or, even real estate, finance, insurance, anything like that. Those middle area sectors, there could be more permanent job losses there. And if those stay, permanent, those jobs are lost for a while, that's what would really slow the recovery. So you'll have, some bounce back initially in employment, and then how high does unemployment stay for how long is really what I'll be watching.
Yeah. And then Rana, you also talked about the pace and how things, for example, Canadians, where the government managed to take a program that in the old days would take them a year to roll out. They managed to roll it out in 2 or 3 weeks. They tweaked it if it wasn't quite right the first time, brought it out the next week later with some modifications, etc. Also, the fact that just the consumers or the average working person like us were able to understand Zoom technology, understand virtual meetings, be able to work from home. We're watching the news at night with, maybe an anchor at the desk, but all the reporters are sitting in their living rooms with their fake backdrops. How do you see that impacting us on a permanent level moving forward? I mean, I don't think this is going to end and we're just all going to go back into our offices and everyone's going to go back to the way they worked before. What do you see the long-term impact on the changes that we managed to do so quickly?
No, that's a great question. I think that all forced adoption curves, happen at the site of a war or some sort of, serious structural change, and often a very abrupt structural change. After World War II, the retooling of the workforce, the ability to sort of take on programs, shift manufacturing, all the things that happened, in the course of a few years, surprised the entire World War II generation. And that pattern that they used for work and for the understanding about the economy and the industrial system sort of went with them through that, through the post period of that. And I think that you'll have the shift towards virtualization didn't happen yesterday. And the preparation for all of this, the huge growth in cloud computing, the huge growth in compute that went behind this, the government of Canada could switch on a program like they did before that, because they've been for the last 5 years flipping their approach to problem solving from the old way of have these long procurement cycles and long dev cycles for companies that weren't working too well to doing faster, more agile cloud-based technology that you see rolled out through things like your when you file your income tax. All of a sudden, all of that was put to the test really quickly, and it performed extremely well. And so I think that that's where you're starting to see in companies themselves, you're taking policies from large organizations. I mean, Facebook went out last week, Shopify in Canada to Square and these sorts of companies, which are large benchmark companies that were employers, huge amount of square feet usage and commitments all over the world. All of them have said, you know what, we're actually working pretty well virtually. And so you could have permanent, 100% at home, or you'll have some component where the office will become a buzz space or places where people can kind of interact, but it won't be the primary measure through what you do. And I think there's going to be a lot of externality effects to that are really going to be beneficial. And some of them are, you have access to a lot wider pool of talent if people are working virtually. You'll be able to push the price point down you'll be able to work from, places that probably have, a great Wi-Fi, but, are cost a lot less than where you're working from. Will it mean the death of cities? Not necessarily. I think that people do want to congregate. There are also agglomeration effects that cities have that, are going to be important in the 21st century for a lot of creative reasons and a lot of the growth of new industries reasons. But I think that all of these impacts are going to be very important, largely because they're demonstrative and people are living them every day.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess on the other opposite side of that is if the virtual world continues, what happens to all the real estate in the major cities, whether it's New York or Toronto or Los Angeles or Chicago? I mean, Toronto 6 months ago had the most cranes in the air with all the new construction we were doing in downtown. A lot of it was office towers. catching up. Now you've got to wonder what that demand is. And if this drags on too long, when you're allowed 2 or 3 people per elevator, you're never going to get people from the ground up to their offices in the first place. So I don't know, Veronica, if you have any thoughts on that, on the real estate side?
Yeah, it is an interesting, the future of especially office spaces. It will be interesting. I mean, I think the patterns emerging so far are clearly that, working from home has, I think, worked better than people were expecting. You could have run into many more technology issues, but it's been, at least personally, fairly seamless. So I think that does allow probably some flexibility down the line. I don't think offices go away altogether. There are, benefits of meeting in person, apprenticeship kind of issues. But yeah, especially in the big cities, it could decrease demand for offices. On the flip side, though, it could also maybe increase demand for more spread out office space. You can't have people sitting on top of each other anymore. But yeah, it is definitely an issue. And for housing, in some of these bigger cities, I mean, especially, on the issue of like rents, if we're looking at, inflation and housing costs, I would think that high unemployment, especially, that does mean downward pressure on a lot of rents. But there is then this transition of maybe people are moving away from cities, but then does that increase housing demand in less populated areas? So it's not necessarily, an across the board downward pressure on real estate activity, just maybe a shift.
Great, thanks. Okay, Rand, I want to shift now to a question that we've got from one of the participants on the webinar here. Very straightforward question, I think. With the border being closed and it was just extended another 30 days last week to, I think it's June 21st. When do you practically see it being opened, and how much pressure does the Canadian government feel on the issue?
I think that it's a day-by-day issue, to be honest. And I think that the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister have been very clear on this. And it's not that people want the border to stay open indefinitely for any other reason that we are very concerned with the public health dimensions of this. And I think that the principles that you outlined to do that say that if we this has to be led by a public health sort of requirement. And I think that the interlocutors, and the good news is the interlocutors in the U.S. are very good on this as well. And so they're at the administrative level. You are seeing an extraordinarily strong level of cooperation. We used to have 400,000 people cross the border every day. There's been a 97% decrease in border crossing, literally overnight. The CBSA was from the initial discussions between our government and the White House to the implementation was less than 72 hours. And we've thus far implemented extremely successful closing down of the largest peacetime border in the world and certainly in history, in a 72-hour period where we didn't see major disruptions to commercial traffic going over that. So so the flexibility and the level of communication between the agencies, which I think that all of you will appreciate, is often where you end up getting a lot of the challenge in these instances, has been extraordinarily adept. That said, I think that as the situation changes, particularly regionally across the country and across the United States, where you have certain regions that are ready to open up faster than other regions, I think that there'll be pressures, but there will also be maybe accommodations that take place. And so I'm not sure where it's going to land coming into the month of June. My sense is that you will start to see sort of an evolution of that border strategy over the course of the summer. And the concern that I've always have here, and I get questions all the time, is that from Canadians and from Americans, like, when can I go up and go back home to visit family, or when can I get it back up to to a business trip or whatnot? And my sense is that if the health numbers are with us over the course of the next several weeks, then we'll be in a much better place come July, August.
Yeah, well, I think the Prime Minister announced about an hour ago that they're going to look into reuniting immediate families and see if they can move that as a first step. So that would go along with what you're saying. Veronica, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, Rana would definitely know more than I do. I just watching day to day. The health issue is certainly, I think, what matters most. And it is positive, obviously, for trade between the two countries is significant. That shouldn't be impacted too much. It's just the tourism, the travel that will be impacted.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of the trade, I mean, we all know the issues, and again, this is another question that's come into us. The issues between, I guess, North America and China, because
Yeah.
we're in the middle of this as well. How important was it for us to get the USMCA, or whatever you want to call it these days, signed, sealed, and delivered? I guess in Canada we did it at the start of this, or
Yeah,
and it
officially.
comes, I think July 1st it comes into effect in the States. So how important is that going to be over the next year or two as we work our way out of this the cycle?
Yeah, I mean, for Canada, certainly very important. Not even so much the deal itself. The details of the deal versus NAFTA. I mean, there were substantive changes. They mattered more for Mexico, honestly. The details of the deal, I mean, we affects certain industries or whatnot, but really the key thing is just lifting that uncertainty. So on a few fronts, I think it's very important that that is now done. Of course, tensions with China have been increasing well before COVID. We had the trade war over 2019, tariffs on China, and that really only looks set to increase. And one thing that all of this has done is increase the awareness of the benefits of onshoring production of certain things. So obviously, for instance, in the COVID case, it's been medical equipment and supplies that have been produced in China. So if there has already been this focus on reducing trade with China, and now there's the added benefits of maybe producing things closer to home for a situation like this, that really benefits Canada. The U.S. can't, of course, produce everything by itself. It will rely on the NAFTA countries, at least bringing production closer to home. So having that deal already in place at least lifts some uncertainty around that issue. You already have that framework of trade, and you just finalized it. It's done and dusted, basically. The other issue where it's incredibly important that it's already done is we will have the U.S. election later this year. And implications for Canada are probably fairly minimal, but really because you've already had this deal completed. So, I mean, the risk of a Trump election, of course, Trump would probably be more, antagonistic towards any country, but probably Canada is the last on that list, especially now that the deal is already done. Similar if you had a Biden victory. The deal in the U.S. did get bipartisan support. So the risk of Biden wanting to tear up the deal that Trump did, I think, is fairly low. So at least now that that is done and out of the way, it relieves all the uncertainty around it, or most of the uncertainty around it.
And Rana, you know more about the USMCA than most of us. Thoughts?
I was on the NAFTA Council during this period. And what I would say that just about, I mean, I agree with everything that Veronica said, is that, in addition to the kind of signal aspect of the deal being done, I mean, there's some substantive things that, we got through this administration and that I think are really important. And one of them has been the level of cooperation and understanding that we have with a lot of the administration officials to really sort of help us during times where there's real uncertainty. Like if we didn't have all of the work and relationships in place that we did during USMCA, we wouldn't have been able to work as effectively in resolving some of the issues around PPE and some of the other COVID-related challenges that we've got going forward. And what I would say as well is that regardless of, we tend to sort of see these things political, but regardless of what party was in power in the United States, we would have had to dealt with a renewal of the NAFTA arrangements regardless. And I think that in the context of that, what we actually achieved was fairly decent, including on dispute settlement mechanism, including on labor, including on making sure that we got some of our initiatives into that agreement that helped us for the future. And so, and what I would also say is that this, the USMCA, CUSMA, NAFTA, All of that fits into a broader picture of what we're trying to do around the world. I mean, Canada, we do not do well in a world that starts to fracture the liberal international order. If it starts to fracture significantly, if we don't, stay close with countries that that have our interests in trade, then we are going to be in a very difficult bind in the decades going forward, in the midst of a very difficult new geoeconomics. And that's where our deal with Europe it actually plays in very smartly right now. Our leadership on a variety of files globally, including on immigration. And what I would say about immigration, and Veronica made a good point in the sense that a full half of any GDP growth is based around population growth, and most of our population growth is as a result of immigration. And we are the place of mass attraction around the world. People are looking to us. We are seeing in the midst of global roiling and weirding going on, climate-related uncertainty, people are looking to us. And so we've got this extraordinary opportunity right now to pivot from a strong place. If we can get ourselves together, and that includes cooperation between not just governments themselves, but also with the business community and others to take advantage of this moment.
Great. Another question we just got coming in, which is, it actually says, Veronica, on how has Citigroup taken a look at discretionary spending? And do we see that bouncing back quickly, or do you think, people I think now are sitting on their wallets, being very careful, but at some point it's the discretionary spending that we're going to have to rely on for a big part of the comeback. Have you guys factored that into the planning process?
Yeah, definitely. So for households, the issue of spending going forward is an interesting one. Obviously this drop in spending that we've had right now is really unlike anything that we've seen before, and that it's a very forced drop in spending. And so some spending does come back, of course, medical, anything like that, housing. But yeah, do people go back to restaurants, or are they afraid to go back out into the economy? I think a lot of that depends, unfortunately, on the health outcomes. Do people feel comfortable going back out again? We would tend to think that yes. There will be pent-up demand for a lot of people who want to go back out into resume their normal lives. Some, of course, if you have residually high unemployment, which is a clear possibility and likelihood, you will, be more cautious with your spending. In both countries, though, I think it has been helpful that the government has reacted so quickly to smoothing household incomes. So you've had, the employment, or the income and spending numbers that we got this morning in the U.S. are a really good example of that. You had a huge increase in income because of all the unemployment benefits and stimulus that have gone out to households, but you had a huge drop in spending, and so savings rates have skyrocketed. And we saw that actually a little bit this morning in the Q1 GDP for Canada, savings rates going higher. So because the government has reacted so quickly, it's not necessarily clear that broad-based household balance sheets for the rest of 2020 are too adversely impacted. For a lot of lower wage workers, the CERB benefit is actually, you're getting more than you would have gotten on unemployment. Similar in the U.S., you're getting $600 a week more with your unemployment, and so you're actually making more than you would have before. And you've had this forced savings that could be, more momentum for some discretionary savings later in the year. Where I would get more worried on discretionary savings or spending patterns are into 2021, where you'll have, you have to start paying interest on your mortgage again, and you have to, pay taxes that you were delayed, and you don't have this extra, benefit, and maybe unemployment is high at that point. So that's where I would be more worried on the pattern for discretionary spending then.
Yeah, great, thanks. And Rand, I want to go back one more time to the USMCA and the recent comment by Democratic candidate Joe Biden on scrapping the Keystone Pipeline. You talked about the key, that we've got the virus problem to deal with. We've also got the oil and gas problem to deal with. Your thoughts on his comments and whether or not he would follow through if he's successful in the election?
Well, look, I mean, I think that, that strand of discussion has been with us since the beginning of the onset of the Keystone process. And look, I mean, we've been clear in just saying, look, we just want to demonstrate the facts of what the North American energy security landscape looks like and how Keystone fits into that, and how our energy industry, particularly our heavy oil, plays into the supply in the United States, and how dependent we all are on this common setup. And that said, that we're clearly, I think the government in Canada has been a strong leader in terms of on the climate agenda, on a sort of the broad discourse around energy transition and our energy systems. We clearly have interlocutors in the United States who are interested in those conversations, and we're making them. But at the end of the day, we are we have there's some very stark facts about where Canada's and North America's energy security is interrelated, and Keystone plays a part in that. And so we are when you have these conversations here, you just need to be able to sort of put the facts on the table to a lot of the players, and to be honest, I mean, I think folks are receptive at an administrative and operative level. People see the great challenges that we're all, in terms of energy transition and our sort of geoeconomics of energy, how they're going to play out. When you put the whole picture together, I think people are more receptive than not, than sometimes depicted media.
Great, thanks. Now we're running out of time, but I wouldn't want to go through this without talking a little bit about a couple of key industries. We're hearing of multi-billion-dollar bailouts in Germany and France on the airline industry. The Prime Minister is now getting asked about it almost daily in his press conferences, and continues to say that they're working on it. Where do you see the airline industry going? What does the government really need to do to help these guys out? Either one of you.
Yeah, I would, one thing that we're looking at least like when we're putting together our economic, forecast for it. Of course, I don't cover the industry in depth, but a good comparison is something like September 11th in the U.S. That, of course, hit airlines pretty significantly, hit air spending. It's part of household spending. That drop, this is an even larger drop now, because travel is mandated to be shut down for months. So it's a significant drop, and it really took a while for that spending to return to normal. So that really would be one of the last industries that we would expect a bounce back, unfortunately. So if you look at the 9/11 case, it really took about 2.5 years in the U.S. for spending to get back to where we were pre 9/11. And this decline is even more significant. So it's going to be that industry will definitely face challenges, I think, for a while. If Rana has any more to say.
Yeah. The only thing I would say to that is that if the period between 9/11 and now, I think that the global airline industry has increased 4x in that. So there was clearly a bounce back in, even through SARS, through so many different crises, through the Icelandic volcano, if you recall that, a number of years back. So there's been a number of interruptions in the global sector over that time. The other thing I would say is that this is an industry that has historically run on extremely low margins, and run in various countries in ways that have always been very close to looking through for assistance, if it's not through the Chapter 11 process in the United States. But the Canadian industry, Air Canada and WestJet, I think, as the mainstay, have actually performed very well globally and also financially. And so I think that they've been well-run companies that are part of a sort of a bigger essential transportation ecosystem here that we have in Canada. And so I think that there's going to be a lot of receptivity to ensuring that we have a viable airline sector going forward.
And then I think also on the, again, shifting, going back, if Trump continues, or certainly he has been very much a protectionist president. Is that likely to continue if he's reelected into beyond this?
Yeah, I mean, I would think so. I mean, especially the focus, of course, is mostly on China still. We had thought that the Chinese trade deal was done at the end of last year, and that would have been on the back burner for a little while. Of course, I think the COVID issues, the new issues with Hong Kong, that kind of brings everything to the fore again. And it is really something, at least in the U.S., that, I mean, the China issue in particular does get some bipartisan support. No one really wants to be on either side of the aisle seen as being soft on China. And it is something that can rally his base. So yeah, I would think that all continues.
What I would say to that I think that we are in the midst of a huge geo-economic shift. The United States is the least trade dependent country of the major economies. We can expect if you don't get America first, maybe America's first sort of strategy going forward, but you may also, I think we can expect greater regionalization. And Veronica mentioned earlier about nearshoring. There will be some profound changes going forward. And these are not necessarily just, the policies of one government. I think that you're likely to see this as a secular shift going forward. So those who argue for free trade, and we need to make the case a lot stronger. We need to make sure that trade is seen as being fair as well. And also we're in the midst of, the change from the analog to the digital, and all of the economic shifts that sort of come along with that. And so recognizing that, we're in a very different trade circumstance globally right now.
Okay, and then finally, because I think we're close to time, Veronica, you mentioned the immigration issue and the importance that Canada continue with its fairly aggressive immigration policy. Any thoughts on, do we need to increase it? Maintain it? I mean, obviously you're not for cutting it back, but any thoughts on where it should go maybe 5 or 10 years if you were to look down the road?
Yeah, I mean, it's from a social issue. I mean, what we see in the U.S. is that there is some backlash against immigration, so it is something that you want to do carefully. I think maintain, if there is what the path that immigration was on before, especially what you would classify as economic immigration, someone who's coming for the purpose of working and helping support the economy. All of that, I mean, that really has been what has fueled economic activity for the last few years. If you look at the very fundamentals of what is GDP, what is growth, it is how many people are working and how productive are they when they are working. And productivity has been maybe a little bit on the side, and so you've had to really rely on that population growth, that how many people are working to really support growth. Yeah, the more interesting, I think, issue after all of this is the desire for immigration going to come back? I hope so. Policy, I would hope stays supportive as it has been, but are people more hesitant to move given any health concerns or anything like that? I would hope not, but it's a kind of wait and see kind of issue.
Rana, any comment?
Yeah, I think that immigration has been one of our secret sauces in this last several decades, and it's been it's great credit to everyone in the Canadian political and economic system that it has been across the board consensus that it's a good thing for the growth of Canada, and for a couple of reasons. One is that we've been selective in our immigration. We've been very successful in making sure that we've worked to build the license to do immigration, meaning we've been settling folks well. We've been working with provinces on provincial nominee programs, many different, connecting immigrants to the workplace in a lot more significant ways. And I think that the success of that, speaks volumes. And if you think about industries like the tech industry, which is going to become, the engine of this next economy, it will be the auto industry, it will be the energy industry of, the 21st century. And people are flowing. People are coming to Canada for the reasons that we've put into place. The global skills strategy that was put in place with this government in its last mandate is arguably one of the most important economic strategies that the government has actually, in any government in the Western world, has done. It's bringing in literally, tens of thousands of new people into Canada who will be the builders. They'll be the Tobys and the Harleys who built Shopify of the next generation. And to be able to keep that going is imperative for us. And the second issue around immigration that's really important is that in this economy, scale matters. And so one of the things, we're living in a tougher, different world where we don't have Pax Americana necessarily to shelter behind. We don't have a lot of the world order that we used to. And Canada needs scale. And so the city of Toronto, 6 million people, in the greater area, when that hits 10, all of a sudden a whole set of network effects start to happen, and we have real impact globally. And so I think that we need to be thinking about scale and how we're building scale going forward.
Great. Well, I think we're basically out of time. I was going to ask you probably an unfair question, saying that assuming we have a vaccine a year from now, where do you see the economy in North America 2 years from now?
Interesting. Yeah, it's a good question. I think there will be, there will just be the businesses who didn't survive. And of course, then it doesn't even matter if the vaccine they just won't be coming back. So there will just be some permanent loss from this that will take longer. I would hope that we have a vaccine a year from now and things can start to resume. I would say that in 2 years, then we're getting back to closer to what we looked like before this, hopefully.
Rana, quick thought?
I think that we'll come back. When we talked about V shapes, U shapes, all the W shaped recoveries, I think we might be in for a square root shape economy comeback, in the sense it might look like it will come back, but then there's going to be a period of kind of real structural adjustment that's going to take place in the economy. And that's all the things that, Veronica had mentioned have been working themselves out, all of the debt that overhang from the crisis, all of the uncertainty in the structural shifts that have taken place. And I think that the real opportunity there will be, the people who will have made the shift will be off to the races. Big tech is going to get bigger. The power in the economy is going to shift in some profound ways under the surface during this period. And so I think it's going to be a very different type of economy. So it won't look exactly like we have right now.
Well, thank you. And thank you both very much. I think we've learned one thing. It's the recovery is going to be somewhere between a swoosh and a square root. So I just hope the barbershop opens up one of these days so I can get back to the old days. Anyways, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Christina, just to wrap things up.
Well, thank you to both of our panelists, Veronica and Rana, for their insights into the future of economic relations between Canada and the U.S. and what we can expect in the months to come. Veronica, your comments on the rebound actually looking like a bit strong, or like a swoosh, was actually one of the most positive perspectives I've heard in the past couple of weeks. And Rana, you setting the stage for the type of numbers we can expect to see during the economic rebound, notably in light of an upcoming election, was very helpful. Both of your comments on the responsiveness of government during this period, especially when it comes to the different measures of support for businesses and Canadians, is especially of interest to those of us working in the government relations and public affairs space. And thank you to everyone who logged on today and joined us for our second webinar session. We appreciate your feedback, so please take a moment to respond to a short survey that should be popping up onto your screen shortly. In the meantime, everyone stay safe, and we hope to see you all again next time.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.